Here at Philips, we're very lucky to host collectors from all over the world. Most often they come to see pieces from our upcoming sales. However, some we see more often. Today, we are lucky to host Dr. Helmut Crott, an auction veteran, an author, a friend and advisor of Philips in association with Bax and Rousseau. Helmut, it's always a pleasure to see you here in Geneva. You often come with pieces that wow us. Today is no different. On the occasion of the 250th anniversary of Urban Jürgensen, you've brought to us a fine selection of pieces that represent the brand's history.
It is my great pleasure. Thank you for this invitation and the possibility to present a part of my collection of Jürgensen. And it's a pleasure to be here.
Of course, today we're seeing pieces, for the first time. We're going to go through the whole chronology, starting the first generation with Jürgensen.
Yes, Jürgensen. Yeah, Jürgensen, he tried to implant horology in Denmark. He wanted to become independent of the centers of watchmaking in London, in England, and in Switzerland. So he tried to create, for the first time in Denmark, a watch factory. Jürgensen, his aim was to fabrication and a quantity, and starting this reputation of Jürgensen. And then his second generation, his son Urban, he had a higher ambition. He wanted to become a precision timekeeper. He was approaching in a more scientific way. So he was a little bit away from the today everyday's watch, the usual watch. He wanted to make marine chronometers. This was still the time when English chronometers were practically dominating the market for these things.
They set the standard, didn't they?
Yes.
They set the standard.
They set the standard. And the demand for the naval offices was very high in those days. And the Danish state had an interest to have an independent fabrication of marine chronometers. We started here with pocket deck watches, which were used on ships at those days, and this is 220 years ago, and they're still running, and they were made in single pieces or in very small series. Mm-hmm. This one is called a deck chronometer with a special dial, so-called regulator dial. Mm-hmm. And this is a series of 7 or 8 which were made to go to sea. And next to it we have the so-called Krusenstern chronometer, which is the most famous watch I think the Jürgensen family ever made. Mm-hmm. It was a present from the king, or an order from the king of Denmark, mm-hmm. to Urban Jürgensen, with kind of saying, make the best chronometer, whatever it costs, Mm-hmm. So, and this chronometer was then presented by the king of Denmark to the famous Russian navigator and cartographer Baron von Krusenstern. The watch is so famous, today we call it the Krusenstern. Mm-hmm. And the present was made in 1821, and afterwards the watch was going on several trips with ships testing, and several scientifics tested this watch. Mm-hmm. And there is a lot of communication literature about this watch. These kind of pieces were conversation pieces of the very rich and scientific interest with aristocracy in those days. So here is the inscription says this is from the King Frederick VI of Denmark, mm-hmm. to Baron von Krusenstern. Typical case, double case of this period. But what is what is special about this watch beside the history, the layout,
What's inside, of course.
the layout of the chronometer is very different from any high-class French or English chronometer of these days, you know. Is a piece which Jürgensen designed. There is a drawing from Jürgensen with this, and the finishing and putting all together, the finishing was done by his son, Louis Jürgensen, who had the same philosophy, being a chronometer maker, being a maker for the Admiralty in Denmark. This chronometer is, beside the size, he is very unusual. When you look on the dial, you have this so-called regulator dial with indication of minute, with the big hand, with the hours, extra dial, sub-dial, and the second dial. And here you have the réaumur or the thermometer. This dial is somehow magic because it was also typical for the few tourbillons made by Aurier and 2 or 3 other makers in the Locle. They had the same dial configuration, you know. And so to find this here on a chronometer is aesthetically a pleasure, and to look on this, and the finishing inside of the movement, of course, is the finest quality.